Hello, my name is Ray Dogum, and welcome to the Vibecast. Thank you for joining us as we explore the exciting advancements in technology-enabled collaboration to excel important drug development. VibeBio seeks to find every cure for every community. We think big as no one should be left behind in the pursuit of living a healthy, happy, and productive life free from disease. Collectively, we have the skills, we have the technology, we have the passion. We now need the community catalyst to bring it all together. That's Vibe. We see a future where communities of biopharma experts and patients collaborate to identify high potential rare disease medicines and have the ability to access capital on demand to develop them. The Vibecast is our weekly informational podcast as we explore some of the hottest topics in drug development and decentralized science with some of the dynamic people that make up the Vibe community. Join us to learn, imagine, question, and help us identify and develop solutions together. Our guest today is Sarah Hamburg. I met Sarah back in DeSci London in January, so I'm really excited to speak with you again. And Sarah, why don't we start with you giving the audience a background about yourself?
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here. My undergrad was neuroscience, and then I studied psychology, and then I actually worked for quite a while before I entered academia and did a PhD. So between that, I was in sort of the nonprofit sector. I worked for some sort of cancer research charity and Alzheimer's disease charity, and I also worked in the NHS for a year, which was really interesting. And then I went more into academia, and I worked at University College London in the division of psychiatry. I did my PhD there while I was working. And then I moved to King's for a year as well. So I think I was in academia maybe for about 5 years, concentrating on sort of cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience. And then I left academia.
What was the title of your thesis? I'm curious.
Oh my God, that's an amazing question that I don't know the answer to. It was like, so I was looking at resting state activity with EEG. So, which resting state is when the brain is not doing anything particular. So you're not like playing any noises or showing anybody any pictures. You just ask your participant to sort of sit there still and just kind of like think of nothing in particular. So I'm really interested in the brain at rest, and I did EEG, so electroencephalography, and I was looking at dynamic causal modeling, which is a way of looking at connections within the brain, and I was focusing on younger adults with Down syndrome, looking at differences in intellectual ability and correlating that with differences in the brain activity. So I'm sure the title is like a mishmash of some of the keywords there. I actually can't remember what it was. It was actually quite a while ago that I did it, but that's a good question.
That was a good summary. I appreciate that.
And then I left academia. I wanted to just do something different for a while and learn some new skills. And I was very interested at the time in fintech. I was interested in cryptocurrencies, and I ended up working in a fintech consultancy for a year called Capco. I was on the R&D team. And then I went and worked in JP Morgan for 2 years, sort of in their global technology line of business, which makes it sound like line of business sounds so small. It's like basically the equivalent of like, I think they had like $12 billion budget. They're one of the biggest tech companies like that there is, but it's within JP Morgan, which is very interesting. And I was working on innovation there essentially. So that was really 2 years during COVID. And then after that, I went down the Web3 rabbit hole and was working at the intersection of science and Web3. And I've kind of been there ever since, apart from a couple of months ago, I went back to academia. It's funny how people talk about it as like leaving and going back. It's all connected as far as I'm concerned. And now I'm doing a postdoc.
Awesome. That's incredible. What is your postdoc focused on?
So again, there's probably a lot of buzzwords in this. So I'm looking at neuromorphic computing, which is a new computing architecture, although, well, it's not that new, but it's relatively new computing architecture, which is brain inspired, and developmental robotics. So developmental robotics is taking inspiration from how humans learn and applying them in robotics. And I'm looking at the intersection, which I guess is developmental neurorobotics. So that's what I'm looking at the moment.
That's a hot topic as well. Very interesting. That's awesome.
Yeah,
and it's incredible that you're doing all that. And, first of all, thank you again for DeSci London and organizing that. I know the team did an incredible job there. And for those that might not know, DeSci London is just one community of many in the world that are taking the concepts of DeSci and introducing it to scientists and researchers to help them just consider different ways of doing science, really. So
yeah, thank you. I was just one of many of the organizers. The main key drivers there were definitely DeSci London core team. So Alfie and Barrett, like they were incredible and they really pulled it off. It was a really great event to be part of.
Awesome. Shout out to those guys. Did a great job. I'm curious about your current postdoc, neuromorphic computing AI, really cutting edge stuff, new things. Can you talk to us a little about what are your goals from doing that? Like, what are you trying to solve and who are you trying to help?
No, yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, neuromorphic computing is something I was interested about for a while. I wasn't actually aware of it until maybe about 5 years ago. I met somebody who was working in the space, and as soon as he explained it's like brain-inspired computer chips, I was like, as a neuroscientist, I was like, oh my God, tell me more. Like, how does this work?
It's
And
the
like the
future,
idea,
right?
yeah, well, I think so. I think it will definitely revolutionize AI, which is one of the reasons why I'm interested in it. And when you actually look at sort of the motivators of it, it's this idea with traditional computing, you have separation between memory and processing, and it's this sort of von Neumann architecture where you constantly have to go back and forth between the two. Whereas the brain, which is like the ultimate supercomputer, like the so low power and the amount of computations that we can do, if you take inspiration from that, it's much more parallel and scalable in that there's no sort of clear separation between the memory and the processing. As with neurons, the processing units, the memory's stored in the strength of connections between processing units. So it's much more parallel, essentially. And because of that, you get orders of magnitude difference in energy consumption. So this will definitely be the future for, I think, sort of like edge devices, things which require low power. In terms of the AI, so it's predominantly spiking neural networks at the moment, which have certain kinds of use cases. But some of the issues that we encounter with it is with traditional algorithms, you need like large data sets and lots of training on it. And we're looking at how, with the postdoc, basically, we're looking at how you can enable more human-like learning. So like this idea of like one-shot learning, like we might be trained as humans on one thing, and then when we see something kind of similar, we can kind of infer how it works. Essentially, I use a phone, and then if a new phone comes along which has different interface, I'm not going to struggle too much. I'm going to have this basic concepts, and it's about that sort of transfer learning. And we're looking at this idea of like, if the AI is more human-like and brain-inspired, well, how do humans learn? We sort of we have skills which build on each other into actual abstract concepts. We have curriculums for learning. So it's taking some of the ideas of how humans learn and putting them into artificial agents, essentially. And one thing we're particularly interested in is embodiment, embodied cognition, which is something I remember my master's was in psychology, and I became really interested back then by this idea of it's not, your body isn't just about processing. It's not just about sensing, well, processing as well. Your mind actually can offload cognition into your body, and your body can actually help you scaffolding with cognitive processes. For example, you see this in children when they count with their fingers. And some of the interesting research from the lab is that if you have a robot and it counts with its fingers, it performs better, like in maths. So one thing we're particularly interested in is math skills and sort of those more abstract concepts. But yeah, it's really combining lots of different fields: neuroscience, which is where I'm coming from, computing, which is I'm learning a lot about, and artificial intelligence as well. But in the field more in general, we use some particular hardware chips, which are called Spinnaker, which are developed by Manchester University. But there's some interesting things going on elsewhere with sort of more like wetware, like neuromorphic computers that are actually a combination of, this is a great paper that came out recently called Dish Brain. It's a combination of like actual like neurons with like electrodes inside, and they taught this dish of neurons to play Pong. So it's a really fascinating intersection of lots of different ideas, lots of different technologies. And I'm personally interested in it very much so because of my neuroscience and psychology background. Like some of the things which I was looking at with my PhD, or which we find in neuroscience, it's very difficult to implement and to test, especially when you're thinking about human cognition. It's very complicated. And for me, I feel like if we can build more sort of synthetic brains, synthetic minds, that will then provide us with a tool which we can then go and test concepts in. So for instance, with my PhD, I was looking at this idea of inhibition and this idea of maybe in the brains of some people, you have over inhibition, too much inhibition. So like the activity is kind of like dampened down. Well, with neuromorphic chips, which actually have like neurons and synapses, you can actually go in and sort of tweak those kinds of variables and see what effect it has synthetically. So you're not doing necessarily animal testing, you're not doing human testing, you're kind of doing something else, this new thing. I personally think it will revolutionize psychology and neuroscience as much as the fMRI machine has, if not more, when we have these new synthetic tools where we can actually test things out. So that's why I'm really interested in it.
That is so fascinating. And I'm imagining testing on a chip, like you're saying, we have that now to some degree for biotech, but doing it in the neuroscience space is sort of more difficult. So that's fascinating. And I constantly think about like the BCI, brain computer interfaces, and how that's going to transform society potentially. Like we'll see how that works out. What do you think about the company Neuralink? Elon Musk's Neuralink.
Oh, yeah. I remember when Neuralink first came about and I was reading about what they were doing. And I remember at the time I didn't have many particularly favorable opinions of what they were doing, but I think I was partly a bit ignorant because there wasn't that much that was obvious from the outside. But I do think some of the engineering is absolutely amazing and fantastic, and like the ideas are good. But I personally am more interested in non-invasive brain-computer interface methods. I actually recently interviewed, I'm starting a podcast as well. I recently introduced my first guest was Sumner Norman, and he's done some amazing research looking at non-invasive or ultrasound for BCIs. So Neuralink is one of many companies who are doing some really innovative work. I think what they're doing is very interesting and very innovative, but there's just so much going on in the space. And actually, the last couple of days after reading this DishBrain paper, I've been really thinking about BCIs, and I kind of think it might end up erring more towards the sort of like exocortex, like wetware kind of scenario, where maybe we take my cells and I freeze them or whatever, like while I'm relatively young, and then maybe when I'm older, I can reprogram those cells into hippocampal cells, and then maybe I can have that implanted, or I don't know if the word's explanted or if I just made that up, or like just stuck on my brain, and maybe my brain can then make use of those new cells. I don't know, but I'm interested. The more I'm in sort of this neuromorphic space, the more I'm interested in how brain-computer interfaces in the future. The word computer is going to be different because we might end up using these neuromorphic chips. And then what are you talking about? If a computer chip is also wetware, then where is even the boundary between the brain computer interface and the neural prostheses and things like that? So, yeah.
This is so fascinating. I'm with you there. And I think, this is initially, I think all these technologies will be focused on trying to help people, like you said, with disabilities or really extreme cases. But eventually, we can imagine, with technology always getting better and increasingly faster, we can imagine everyone sort of leveraging these wetware computer chips or computer cells or stem cells, or I don't know how you want to call it, but to make us smarter, faster, better. I don't know. It's just a weird world to consider. But you have to consider now there are treatments for specific diseases that people are cured from. So like there are, lots of technologies that if we didn't have them, people wouldn't be alive today. So it's not that hard to imagine that stretch to extend it into the brain. It's just a fascinating world.
That's the thing as well. It's so hard to conceptualize these things. That's what I love about technology. What we call a brain-computer interface now will probably look completely different. It reminds me of when I was a kid, and like all those future films that were set in the future from the 80s all look exactly the same because that was our vision of the future. And what we're talking about now in 100 years, the concepts I think will still be there, but we can't even imagine what it'll be like. And that's kind of, that's what makes me so interested, I think, in all this stuff.
Let's take a step back a little bit. We mentioned in DeSci earlier on decentralized science. So there have been many problems discussed about DeSci within it. What do you think are some of the most important problems that DeSci is trying to work on, and that you see some traction in? Like, what are the initial use cases?
Yeah, I think there's such like a myriad of problems in modern science. And I feel like the great thing about DeSci is everybody's kind of focused on, they're kind of like self-assembled into these communities, and they're focused on the particular problems that they sort of feel most passionate about. And that's something that I really love about it. So it's difficult kind of for me as someone who's not working on one particular problem, but from the outside and watching sort of the space change, it seems like a lot of the problems are very interconnected and circular, for me, ultimately, I think the main problems like come down to funding. Like the more I think about it, the more I'm like, that's kind of at the basis for everything, in my opinion. If we had more stable and sufficient funding for science, I think people would be much freer to pursue, the curiosity-driven research and do replications if they want. They don't have to worry so much about publishing in specific journals, so they'll be maybe more collaborative. Things will be more open source because you don't have to be so adversarial almost. Like I just think the lack of funding in science fundamentally drives pretty much all the problems that I can think of. But I would love it if someone has a different opinion and can explain to me why there's some other problem. But yeah, I think DeSci, I think, has a big opportunity to help make funding more transparent and fairer. There's the opportunities. We see big donors like Vitalik donating to science and donating to health, and I think that's absolutely incredible. I think crypto itself offers a whole new funding stream for science that you couldn't have imagined. Like I was talking about earlier, it's hard to imagine the future. Could you imagine if 20 years ago we were talking about this internet money that's going to fund science? Like, you wouldn't even be able to conceptualize that. If you read an article in the past about Shiba Inu and COVID relief in India, you'd be like, what? So I do think crypto has the potential. What that will be in the future is difficult to sort of imagine. But for me, the benefits of decentralized science will ultimately probably come down to funding, but not just the amount of money or crypto or whatever you want to call it. It's also the transparency of it. I have spoken to people over the last year or so, some people in other countries where things aren't basically they've said to me, in their country, scientists get funded from government research, but there's a bit of corruption. Does it actually end up in the science labs? Not all of it ends up in the science labs. So the idea of you can actually track where the money is going is really probably life-changing for many scientists in some countries. And that's not even something I'd even thought about, doing science in the UK. I never thought that my funder will give me some money, but it might not end up with necessarily in my pocket. And also, of course, the idea of everybody, it's very democratic, so you can have people, communities, whole countries even voting on what research they want to fund, and that for me is extremely exciting. You no longer have these sort of, I don't necessarily want to call them gatekeepers, but people who are, it's their job to just assess these things all the time. You can have just anybody from anywhere coming along and just voting in a democratic way what they want the country or the government to fund, or their communities to fund scientifically. So I think that's quite interesting. Sorry, I don't actually know if that even answered your question. You asked me about problems that DeSci could solve.
Yeah, no, you answered the question. I think the problem and the use case that you identified as being lowest hanging fruit potentially, or most important, is this ability to fund or have the crowd or the community fund certain projects in research and science, which is quite interesting because if you think about it, PhD students, especially younger PhD students looking for funding, are one of the most insecure people because they're like, where am I going to get my next grant? And it's also just this mission to apply to grants and finding potential, projects to work on that have funding. So if there was a better way to do that, and I think DeSci is trying to work on that, I think that would help make science happen faster, essentially. It'll accelerate the speed at which materials and start to do their projects and experiments.
And also the thing as well is this idea of science is kind of confined to academia or industry, and we don't have really enough structures, I think, yet, where people can be empowered and funded to do science. It's very difficult to get funding as a scientist if you're not affiliated with a particular university. If you're a citizen scientist and you come up with an amazing idea, and you can now, we can, through decentralized science, you can form a community, you can have a shared wallet, you can get grants, which are really, really quick. That was kind of unheard of before, whereas you had to go to certain set funding bodies. And I think this idea of being able to take science outside of universities is something that I feel really passionate about as well. And I do think that's something which will uplift many countries who maybe don't have the higher education university infrastructure that sort of I've been privileged to be part of.
Definitely. Absolutely. And I think one of the companies that's doing a pretty good job with this is Gitcoin with their DeSci grants. And I just think that is a great example for the entire industry to learn from potentially, and also be part of. So that's really interesting. Another problem in DeSci, or another problem that DeSci I know is trying to solve, is this idea of open peer review. And as a scientist yourself, you've probably done a lot of peer reviews. What is wrong with the current peer review system now, and what can DeSci do to make it better?
I think everyone you talk to probably has a slightly different opinion on what the problems are. I think one of the issues is the time it takes. It takes a very, very long time to submit a paper and then for the editor to source reviewers and then for the reviews to come back. And partly the reason why is because you're asking scientists to do it for free who already are overworked, and it's not necessarily something which is going to be a priority for them. And so maybe you say you can do it, and then like a month later you're like, oh, actually I can't do this, etc. Or, I get emails all the time, constantly, like several a week, asking me to peer review things. If I did, that would be more than a full-time job, like if I said yes to all of them. So I do think there's kind of a lack of people who are peer reviewing research, and that causes some of the problems, the bottleneck problems, in terms of they just can't get enough reviewers. I've heard some people say like this idea of peer review is like grinding to a halt. I'm not an editor, I can't say how true that is or anything like that, but it's something I'm probably part of, because I've definitely said no to a lot of papers. I mean, I review papers, but I've definitely said no to way more than I've reviewed just because I don't have time. And I've definitely said I can review things, and actually it turns out, oh, suddenly I've got a deadline and I really can't review it, so I say no, and that's going to contribute and push things down the line. So I think some of the problems are the time it takes. Obviously, from a researcher's point of view, it's, this idea of being unpaid, which is problematic because you already do a lot of unpaid work in academia, which is relatively low paid to industry anyway, and a lot of people are already overworked. But it is, I have to say, it's a privilege to peer review, and it is part of science. And I think most scientists would say that they do enjoy peer reviewing. You get to sort of like see the newest ideas that are coming through. You get to be part of the big science machine. You feel very privileged to do it. But it does have those issues. Also, the bias as well. Maybe you only get certain types of people who are saying yes. I've spoken to researchers before who have told me that they have hypotheses that most of the people who say yes are junior, or the senior PI says yes and gets their PhD students to do it, which I think is quite common. Or potentially women are maybe more likely to say yes because we are just more used to doing unpaid work, and not being recognized for our work, and potentially the shoulders, it falls on the shoulders of women more for peer review, which is something I haven't seen any research into, and I think it would be very difficult to do so, because it will be, the journals will probably know that information, or maybe not even know the gender of the peer reviewers anyway. I think DeSci is good because you can potentially have more transparency. But there are a few sort of not myths, but there is the way peer review just talked about sometimes in the DeSci community is sometimes not quite accurate, because there's so many different journals out there that do peer reviews in so many different ways. This idea you're unrecognized for peer review. Well, the most recent paper I peer reviewed, they said, do you want this to be associated with your ORCID ID, which is like a researcher ID? And I said yes, so that means that goes towards my academic record. So essentially I'm recognized for it. I haven't been paid for it, but I'm recognized for it. I did speak to someone in Germany once, and they explained that there's a system in place there where if you're a peer reviewer, something to do with the copyright laws, you can actually get a slice of the revenue for the journal somehow. And I wish I could remember the name of this scheme, because I remember looking into it and thinking this would be amazing for DeSci to build some infrastructure around, because a lot of it goes unclaimed because of just issues of red tape, essentially. So there are some ideas like that which are already in place. And also open peer review. I read a paper the other day and it listed the peer reviewers next to it. So that is something which does happen sometimes, not always in the space as well. And as a reviewer, I can send comments to the people the authors, and I can send comments to the editors as well. So if I wanted to, as a reviewer now with the infrastructure we have, I can tell the authors, everything that I have to say. I don't have to hide it from them. But I think peer review has many small problems, and depending on people's experience of it, they will have a different opinion. To me, I do think we can always improve. I really think we can have a better system, but we'll have to see what people build. And ultimately, if the UX is good, as scientists, they're already very stretched. Unless the UX is good, even if you're paid or not, they're not going to use it. So I think that's an important thing for people to consider as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point. And I think it applies to not just peer review applications, but all of the DeSci applications, essentially all applications these days. No one wants to use a product or a service that doesn't have a good experience. Everything has to sort of work right. It's just the expectations we've grown to develop over time. Our phones work great. Everything works pretty smoothly these days. It's not a struggle. So no one wants to sacrifice that. That's amazing. So the evolution of DeSci communities. Now let's think about this. There's only been 5 years, maybe you can argue, that DeSci has been around for. And it's changed incredibly. I think last year was probably the biggest growth period for DeSci from what I've seen. And there's many new communities and organizations and DAOs. There are just so many DAOs now and communities trying to take their community and build value from collectively together. So it's quite interesting. Do you have any specific sort of examples that you want to highlight or point out in the DeSci space that you think are doing some incredible work, just to kind of share with the community to help them understand?
I think it's really interesting how the space has evolved, as you say. Like, I'm really glad to see sort of these geographic hubs forming. I think that's really exciting because I think the problems in science will be nuanced towards certain geographical regions, somewhat, not entirely, but somewhat. So it's nice to see like DeSci Japan, DeSci Africa forming. And I think that ultimately I see these sort of as almost like they could become future institutions. They're almost like a prototype institution where people come and form around ideas, and empowering citizen science in those regions to do science outside of traditional academic halls, I think would be quite exciting to see. Whether or not they want to go that way, that's the way they're going. It's exciting anyway that they're sort of becoming a hub for people in the region. In terms of actual individual like DAOs, I mean, I don't want to I guess I'm excited by Athena DAO. Like, I think what they're doing with women's health is really good, and their talk at DeSci London was amazing. The panel, Laura Minkini, and the panel that she put together for women's health was absolutely fantastic. Like, I learned a lot. It's very insightful. I think what Athena DAO are doing is really interesting. I also think the flip side is interesting, where what's happening is originally lots of DeSci communities were forming, and simultaneously what you have now is communities which have already been decentralized science in a way, like Vibe, but also like the Active Inference Institute, now sort of labeling themselves under the DeSci umbrella and looking how they can incorporate Web3 tools into what they do. So you're kind of coming at it from both ends now, and this is a bit of a convergence between Web2 becoming Web3 maybe abstracting away the Web3, so it feels more Web2. So it's definitely an interesting time for the communities. I quite like what DeSci London have done, specifically because they have built a community, but they're also had the conference, and they're doing things with workspaces, I think, where you can like go and co-work. And they're really definitely building and championing their DeSci community in London, which is really exciting. So I'd love to see more of that. And I'm sure it actually does exist in other cities. I'm not actually based in London, but I try when I go down to sort of connect with the community there. I'm in the north of England. We had snow today, which is quite rare, actually, even though I'm in the north of England. I was in London for a long time, but I've come back up north. If that's anyone's wondering where my accent's from, it's from the north of England. So I do think it's specific communities. Yeah, I like the geographic hubs. I like sort of the DeSci Londons, and then I think what Athena DAO is doing is really cool. There's so many, though, I couldn't even begin to sort of like pull out specifically, but in terms of more traditional decentralized science communities, maybe embracing decentralized science, like the Active Inference Institute. So I'm on the scientific advisory board of the Active Inference Institute, and they're really interesting. They've been working a long time as a decentralized science institute, and they really incorporating some really cool tools into what they're doing, using AI to sort of like they record their sessions, and they'll use AI to like pull out different things and add a DOI, so an indicator, so you can actually start referencing things that have been said throughout the conversations. So yeah, I like what they're doing as well.
That's a good point you just brought up, though, the ability for AI to sort of summarize Zoom conversation, let's say. I think that's not like a huge deal, but if you think about it, it'll help share information more efficiently with a lot of people. Like, people don't have to fully watch a whole video, but they can get the snippets of the important facts, pretty quickly. Yeah. And I think we're going to be seeing that a lot overall as AI starts to develop or starts to become like prevalent everywhere, which is already happening.
And science doesn't just happen in PDF papers, right? It happens through conversations, it happens through podcasts, it happens all the time in conversations and Telegram chats. Like, that's people doing science collaboratively. And how can we take those insights and those conversations and create sort of embed them within the existing scientific narrative and infrastructure for future generations to refer back to and build upon ultimately, so it's not just all lost.
The culture of science has evolved so much over the last, in my experience, like 25 years, 30 years or so. It's been when I was growing up, science wasn't really that cool or interesting, I think. But over time, my personal interest in science grew and grew. And now I'm seeing like everyone is sort of interested in what science can do because it is affecting, they're seeing that it's affecting their lives quite impactfully. So, yeah, any thoughts on like the culture of science, not just DeSci, but the idea of, research and thinking things through and coming up with new ideas that the world hasn't seen before. I mean, that's pretty incredible.
Yeah, I love that actually. I've never really thought about it that in that way. The culture of science has drastically changed. I guess it's because of digitization of everything and the internet, and we're more interconnected than ever. And science ultimately is about sharing ideas. And now we have infrastructure where we can do that instantly with anybody anywhere in the world in a second. We're just having this massive exponential growth. And I feel like we almost, as scientists or as society, don't really understand how to harness that, or even like what to do about that. Like as I'm saying now, talking in a podcast is almost like adding to the scientific consensus and literature, and how do you extract that and then actually embed it in a way that other people can build upon. I don't think we're quite there yet. I think there's just lots of very interesting experiments, and maybe it's a sort of millennial thing and growing up with the internet. Like in my house, I was quite lucky because my uncle's computer scientist, so we always had like his old computer, and I remember we had MS-DOS, and I had to like learn to like do the code in MS-DOS to play the computer game or whatever. And so I grew up seeing computers evolve from that into like this. I have a supercomputer, well, not a supercomputer, but what I would have labeled a supercomputer back then in my pocket now, and I carry it everywhere with me. And I can ask, I chat to chat GPT all the time, like asking it to summarize things, and give advice for things, and also obviously just play around with it. So I think from in my lifetime, all our lifetimes, where we've seen technology go from and to has been a massive driver for people being more interested in it. I guess technology and science aren't necessarily the same thing. For us, maybe our generation, they feel very intertwined, maybe future or past generations not so intertwined. But of course, with COVID pandemic and things like that, science, everyone became an expert, So it's a super interesting time, I guess, for science culture because of the new technologies and the global pandemic as well. And obviously chronic health conditions, lots of people have them, lots of people know of somebody with a chronic health condition, and so I think we're ever more conscious of our health, mental and physical, and that plays into science as well.
Let's take a step into the future, because we're talking about a lot of AI and science and things, and I'm sure you've heard of the singularity. It's this concept that like the year 2045 or something, humans and AI will sort of merge or something like that, or we'll upload our brains. It was this concept by Ray Kurzweil. He kind of coined it. What do you think about the singularity?
I feel like just your explanation then, I feel like I've already merged with AI. Like I use it constantly, like every second, like not every second, but AI is probably every second on my phone using me. Its algorithms are probably sending me things. And I use it on our Zoom call now. There'll be some AI probably like filtering out noise and etc. So I think AI is already embedded in our lives. I guess it depends at what point you would say that we have become one with the AI. And I'm not sure at what point that would be. I guess coming back earlier to what we were talking about before at the start, the brain-computer interfaces, or like exocortex, I suppose that would be an obvious merging because it's part of your body. But personally, because I'm interested in embodiment, and there's this idea of radical embodiment as well, that like our tools, our phones are part of our cognitive world, and they're part of we offload our cognition to them already. In terms of that concept or theory, the AI is already part of me in a way. Like, so I think it would depend on what mood I was in at the time when you asked that question, where I said what my opinion of the singularity was and when it's happening and what will happen with it. But I think history has taught us anything, we're not very good at imagining what's coming in the future.
That's for sure. All we can say is that it's happening faster than it happened in previous years. That's sort of like the exponential curve we're seeing now. And we've seen for the last, 100 years, you can argue. That's fascinating. So one area you kind of talked about, BCI a lot actually, but other wearables, other sort of, I don't want to say other wearables, but like personal wearables devices, like talking about AI, we all probably have like a wristwatch or something that has some AI in it potentially. How do you see that sort of improving people's lives? I know that, there's some obvious ways you can like monitor your heart rate and all that stuff and kind of make recommendations, but if you combine that with the BCI devices, I know what kind of world are we going to live in like 5 or 10 years? And I know I'm asking you to predict the future, and you don't. I know that no one can do that, but I'm just curious what you think.
I love the fact you're asking me that question. What kind of world are we going to live in? That's the coolest question ever. I mean, I don't know the answer, right? But I can tell from my experience with wearables and where I think kind of the value add would be. So yeah, I'm really interested in wearables and the data that we get from them. So I wear an Oura ring and it tells me about my sleep. It tells me about everything. It tells me about my steps. And I find it absolutely fascinating. And I think everybody, not everybody, a lot of people these days do find it very interesting. As a society, we're becoming more and more interested in our health. And I personally, so I have a medical condition called fibromyalgia, and that affects me. It's very variable. Like some days I'm absolutely fine. Most days I'm absolutely fine, but some days for absolutely no reason that I have ever been able to discern is like, I just feel like I've been hit by a bus. I'm just like in absolute chronic pain. Sometimes it lasts days. And for me, I'm interested in the future of wearables, of enabling people like me to be able to monitor better their health and their triggers for things like that, and then ultimately being able to pool data like that so you can feed that back into science, and people can do more studies on more data, and then we can have more answers for everybody like me. So yes, I think wearables are good for empowering the individual with their health, but I think where the real value add is at societal level, if we can leverage the data from wearables, which is why I was interested in this when myself and Alexandra McCarroll, we did the Links project, which was looking at Web3 for leveraging data from wearables. So as a patient, as a human, I can own my own data and I can pull that in a big data pool, and scientists or pharmaceutical companies can come along and they can test the data and mine it for insights. And I think if we have more data about more people, we will have more insights, and then we will have more, hopefully more treatments and knowledge about health and disease and environmental factors as well, toxins or anything else which is happening in people's environments.
Yeah, and I'm with you there. And I think every human is sort of like a scientist in their own way. Maybe they're not all great scientists, fine, but they are all generating data, right? And in that way, that data can be hopefully in the future somehow integrated, maybe in an open, decentralized way into this system, and maybe in a privacy preserving way as well, so that we can all learn about ourselves individually and what we should be doing, like personalized medicine, but also as like a using our genetic information as well, like how we've evolved, like how are we slightly different, and why are some people able to do things others can't, and I think those insights will help to drive treatments to a lot of issues. And first of all, and in addition to that, thank you for sharing about your fibromyalgia condition. I think that's I'm sure you've had to go through a lot of different trial and error and trying to figure out first how you got diagnosed or when you got diagnosed, and then any treatments or like tips or symptoms that you can relieve in certain ways, and all the things that you've picked up over your years. I'm sure you would love to be able to share with someone like immediately, directly, so they can help themselves. But it's hard because everyone's got that personal journey, and identifying those solutions are sort of, you can read a few books, or maybe you can talk to a doctor, and that helps. But at the end of the day, everyone has this personal journey of life. And I just hope that we can eventually one day, as a community of people, come together and provide, insights to help each other. And I think that's what we're trying to do. I think that, it just takes time, and we shouldn't rush it either. I think like if we rush it, it's going to create issues as well. So
I agree. Yeah, I think one of the main drivers for me being interested in decentralized science is I've had a chronic health condition since I was 19, and fibromyalgia has very much had, it had the bad rep. It's like, oh, it's all in your head or whatever. And I think it was just very under researched. I think in the last 5 years in the UK, I read a stat that they spent 1.8 million on fibromyalgia research.
Just 1.8 million.
Yeah, which is like the price of a house in London, and it's like apparently 1 in 20 people have like some degree of fibromyalgia, and it's sickeningly underfunded, and predominantly because I think a lot of it is difficult to diagnose, and it's difficult to monitor, so you don't really have necessarily the biomarkers for drug trials and things like that, and also it predominantly affects women, and women's health is radically underfunded. So I do see DeSci as a potential way of galvanizing communities who have been underfunded, and helping them, empowering them to share their data, create biobanks, digital biobanks, and hopefully get some additional funding, maybe a little bit more than 1.8 million over 5 years would be nice, to help people who are essentially, chronic health conditions, of which there are many different ones, and most of them have this aspect of fluctuating. My brain. Fluctuating, and that's another thing as well with fibromyalgia. You get this thing called fibro fog, and sometimes your words just come out a load of nonsense, and you just have to kind of like deal with it. So that's another aspect of it, where you have these very cognitive and physical symptoms in fibromyalgia, which is why it's, I think, a particularly interesting condition as well, which if we funded research into it would probably actually teach us a lot about cognition and mental health and cognitive ability and cognitive longevity and all those things, which everybody's interested in, not just people with fibromyalgia. Anyway, I'm ranting now.
No, that's a great point. I think there are things to learn from studying other diseases. So there's like a lot of overlap and I'm sure fibromyalgia has like overlap with other sort of women's health issues as well. So it's really interesting to consider studying it. Do you know of any like patient communities for fibromyalgia that maybe you're a part of or maybe you're aware of? And then are there any, aside from Athena DAO, which has talked about fibromyalgia, are there other DeSci organizations that are looking into that? Just curious.
Yeah, it's a good question. So there is charities all over the world, like different countries will have like their own charities, which again, I feel is a little bit problematic sometimes when it comes to a global health issue. There's a UK fibromyalgia charity, which I used to be a trustee of years ago. There's one in the US, I forget the name, and it's very disparate and they don't really connect together. And I think this is similar with lots of illnesses. And that's partly why I'm interested in DeSci as well, because of the global nature of connecting global communities. So things aren't as siloed anymore. Yes, Athena DAO are more concentrating on reproductive health. There is, I did speak to someone recently who's interested in creating a DAO around chronic pain in general, but I do feel the problem with fibromyalgia is it's often lumped in with pretty much anything that you can lump it in with, and that's partly because historically it was under rheumatology, and now I believe in the UK at least it's more under neurology, which is where I believe it should sit. But a lot of the funding, I think in the UK, it's like from arthritis research, and it's like, oh gosh, we're just lumped in with anybody. So I don't believe there is a dedicated fibromyalgia DAO. Sometimes I think about starting one, but obviously I'm a bit busy, and maybe in the future, I would love it if somebody did start a fibromyalgia fund though, because it's chronically under research, but the amount of value you have there adding to 1 in 20 people's lives alone, but also the amount of science that scientific discoveries that will probably generate in terms of the mind-body interaction, the pain, we all understand pain, immunological. Luckily, I think there's been a bit more funding recently because of it's a post-viral syndrome, and some people call it post-viral syndrome. For me, it was post-viral. I got glandular fever when I was 19 and kind of I got it after that. So because of COVID, we're having more funding into post-viral syndromes. Thankfully, some of that will feed back into understanding more about fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue as well. But ultimately, it's all meshed in, and I think it needs a big rethink of even how it's framed and diagnosed and what it comes under in order to even access more funding streams, is my opinion.
Yeah, and if anyone out there listening is working on fibromyalgia, decentralized science work, reach out to us, reach out to Sarah. I think we're both interested in just learning more about that. So awesome. Sarah, this has been an amazing conversation and interview. I thank you so much for your time. Is there anything else that you wanted to share with the audience today?
I don't think so. Just thank you for having me on. This has been amazing. Oh, sorry. Yes. Well, I did want to mention that I'm starting my own podcast. So if you follow me on Twitter, you'll get the updates on that. But I've learned a lot from you. You're a very skilled podcast to interview, and I'm gonna have to go back and rethink how I'm doing my podcast. I think I've learned a lot from you. So thank you.
Tell us what your podcast is about again.
Oh, so it's called As We March Backwards into the Future, and it's really just about me interviewing people in the space, but like you're doing here. I'm interested in interviewing people who are really sort of pushing the boundaries of current technology, pushing ways of doing things in innovative ways. So probably lots of people from the DeSci space. I've got a few lined up. Also, I'm probably going to have a bit of a neuroscience theme because I'm obsessed with the brain, but going more into other sort of avenues of science as well. So yeah, I'm hoping to release my first episode soon. But also might not, because it's just me motivated to do it. So I'm sure it will come out eventually, and then I'll keep interviewing people, and hopefully people will like it. And if you don't, at least I've had fun.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. I'm looking forward to it. When and if you publish it, I think it sounds like you're going to be interviewing some of the rebels in the science space. So that's awesome.
Yeah, I did actually think about calling it Rebel Science for a
Oh,
while, which is much more catchy, but I also wanted a bit of a weird title just because I thought it was cool.
I like the first title. Great. Well, for the audience, if you have any questions, concerns, or ideas generated from this discussion today, please reach out to us by email or via our socials. We would love to talk to you and invite you to join the Vibe community. So thank you again. Like, follow, subscribe. Really appreciate it, everybody. Sarah, thanks again. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.